Yeah, please go ahead. Absolutely.
Thank you, ma'am. Dear Jayantians, I would like to bring to your notice a few general instructions. Please keep your microphone on mute, kindly maintain silence throughout the session, and students, please maintain the Jayantian decorum. A grateful and prayerful heart is the beginning of all greatness. I request you all for a silent prayer. Thank you. I quote, know what sparks the light within you, so that you, in your own way, can illuminate the world. A very warm good morning to one and all present here. On behalf of the Department of Economics, it's my esteemed privilege to host this guest lecture on the occasion of International Women's Day on the theme Embrace Equity. I am extremely delighted to offer a hospitable welcome to this auspicious gathering through the Zoom platform. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Sakshi from First Year MA Economics for the welcome address and to introduce our today's resource person, Dr. Bala Subramanian. Thank you, Sakshi.
Good morning to one and all. I quote, empower yourself with a good education, then get out there and use that education to build a country worthy of your boundless promise. Michelle Obama. Today, I'm extremely delighted to offer a hospitable welcome to this auspicious gathering. We have amidst us Dr. Soumya Balasubramania, Senior Economist at the World Bank, Washington, District of Columbia, United States. It's indeed my privilege to welcome you on the behalf of the Department of Economics, Kristu Jayanti College. I also take this opportunity to welcome Dr. K. Vinoda Devi, Head, Department of Economics. She is the guiding light of our department. It's my privilege and honor to welcome you, ma'am. I also extend a cheerful welcome to the faculty coordinator of today's program, Dr. Shiva Subramanian K, and faculty members of Department of Economics, and my dear Jayantians. Learning brings knowledge, knowledge brings experience, experience brings wisdom. With this, I introduce today's resource person, Dr. Soumya Balasubramania. Ma'am completed her BA Honours in Economics from Delhi University and MA Economics from Delhi School of Economics. She completed her PhD in Environmental Economics and Policy from Duke School of the Environment, Duke University, USA. Ma'am worked as a teacher and research assistant in Duke University, USA. She also worked as a senior research in International Water Management Institute, CGIAR, Sri Lanka. Currently, Ma'am is working as a senior economist at the World Bank, Washington, District of Columbia, United States. Ma'am has been awarded Chair, Committee for Women in Agricultural Economics, International Association of Agriculture Economists, 2020 to 2024. Nicholas School Student Council Outstanding PhD Student of the Year, 2010 to 2011. Ma'am has also received various awards from reputed institutions and organizations. Ma'am's research mainly focuses on poverty and development challenges in Asia and Africa at the nexus of water, food, health, and energy using methods of program evaluation, microeconometrics, and non-market valuation. Gender, equity, and environmental considerations are important components of her work. We are honored to have you, ma'am, for this session. Once again, I welcome you.
Thank you. That's very, very kind of you. Very flattering to hear all of that stuff. You're being very generous, but thank you. I don't know about wisdom, but I think wisdom is really about understanding what we don't know and just being honest about, what we don't know and what we don't understand. And I hope I can do some of that. Today. Is this over to me now? And do I take this through, or how does this work?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. Okay. So I had so what I did was when I spoke to Dr. Devi over an email exchange, she suggested that I sort of make a few remarks, talk a little bit about my work, and then we open it up for questions. So I'll try to keep my part of it short so that there's more time for questions and discussion and conversation. So first of all, Happy Women's Day to everybody, not just the women, but also the men, because I'm sure you all have women in your lives that you love and respect, and whose happiness is a component of your happiness, and your happiness is a component of their happiness. And so let's try and sort of organize ourselves in our public and private lives in a way that we can support one another and think about diversity and inclusion at the same time. So let me start by, so I'm just going to end up sharing my screen here. So I'm going to do this. Let me know if you can see it.
You have to go when you can do it.
Yes, ma'am, we can see it.
Lovely.
Yes.
All right. Let's see what we can do out here. Perfect. And if you stop seeing it at some point in time, just let me know. Okay. So let me talk about how I came to do what I did, and in the process also talking a little bit about what I do. And let me start off by saying that, of course, everything that I'm talking about here is me. It's not the official position of the bank. It's one of the things I have to remember to say every time I do a presentation now. And I'm going to talk about the power of research and taking research into policy, which is an interesting nexus of things. How are you technically rigorous and yet do things in a way that's practical and implementable? Because often academic research and policy research can be mutually exclusive, but I think through this talk, I want to show that they don't have to be. And I think it really depends upon the way you handle your research agenda and what motivates you at the end of the day. So let me talk about what does this all mean, right? So when we talk about environment and development, what does that even mean? Let's just unpackage that. So environment largely, when we think about problems such as pollution, air pollution, water pollution, depleting groundwater levels, deforestation, these are largely what the economics literature calls market failures, right? So essentially, there is a divergence between private benefits and social benefits and private costs and social costs, and so the market fails. And so economic theory would essentially say, well, since there's a divergence between the private and the social, why don't we quote unquote internalize externalities? And economic theory tells us there are two broad ways to do that. The first is what we might call a Pigouvian solution, which is essentially, well, tax the externality, right? So think of things like a carbon tax or a tax on smoke, coming out of factories and chimneys. And there's a big sort of conversation on how do you even set the value of the tax, and people would say, oh, it's the opportunity cost and all of that stuff. But essentially, use pricing as a way to internalize the externality, and that's the Pigouvian solution. The other solution is the Coasian solution, which basically says, hey, the reason why markets fail is because nobody has a right to clean air and nobody has a right to clean water. So why don't we create that market by creating permits for clean air, and then people have to literally buy the right to pollute. Right? And so those are broadly speaking, the kinds of solutions that economic theory at least tells us would be potential ways to solve these market failure problems. Now, the problem with all of this stuff is, do these necessarily work in the presence of poverty? And in contexts where poverty is extremely rampant, right? So think of a country like India, where yes, there's a lot of pollution coming from farms, but all of these farms are so small that these essentially become non-point sources of pollution, right? They're not large farms like the United States where you can tag them, geotag them, use remote sensing methods to actually see what they're up to, etc. Right? So in the presence of poverty, a number of these sort of traditional solutions actually are not implementable, in part because the transaction costs of implementing them are very high, but also the equity implications of implementing them are very high. These kinds of solutions can often be very disproportionately burdensome on the poor. So the question is, what do you do? And that's kind of what I think about. That's the box in which I think about. And I do it through research, which means I bring in rigorous evidence, but at scale. So all the stuff that I've studied so far is usually representative of countries. So I collect my own data, I do large sample surveys, I don't do small sample surveys. And then I use those insights to provide evidence for decision-making, as well as course correction in ongoing development processes, programs, policies, etc. But how did I get into all of this stuff? And this is, I was barely 20 years old in this photograph, so which was a very long time ago, trust me. And so some of this is just to say that serendipity matters, because people often ask me, how did I get into this? And frankly, I think it was a serendipity. There was no plan. I got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in India. And then I did an internship at the end of the second, back then it used to be a 3-year program. And so at the end of the second year, before the beginning of the third year, I did this internship where I worked with a person who had been in academia, but then had come back, into India to sort of put up their own think tank and think about problems and think about how do you practically solve problems. And so I sort of ended up working with them, and it gave me a really nice insight into how you can how do you take things from paper and start thinking about them in practical terms. And I think that's where I got interested. Frankly, I don't think I had any idea of doing this, but that's where I think the idea kind of caught on. And the other thing and so when I did that internship, I ended up writing a bunch of things. I wrote something for the Financial Express. I wrote something for the Economic Times. I was very scared looking at this stuff because, this is stuff I wrote more than 20 years ago. And so when you go back to seeing things, you're not quite sure how you feel about the stuff that you've done back in the day. It's not too bad. Anyway, and then the other thing that happened, this is stuff that we did back then there used to be a planning commission. It's called the Niti Aayog now, but it used to be the Planning Commission. And so this is stuff that we did. The Planning Commission had a journal, and we wrote something about water there. And, the other one is from Down to Earth, which is the Center for Science and Environment's magazine, where we were commenting and we were supporting the government in order to think a little more creatively about the national environmental policy that had been implemented. This was in 2003, 2004. So this is a long time ago. And then the other thing that happened was I ended up actually working in a team of people who were recruited in order to implement a primary data collection activity across Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh in order to evaluate a joint forest management program, which had been funded by the World Bank and implemented by the government of India. And so I kind of got an insight into how do you collect data in order to think about course correcting policies and programs, because this data was being collected by the bank in order to inform ongoing processes. And I think that's where the idea came. And I realized that I needed to go and skill up. And so that's what I did. I went and got a PhD. And I got my PhD at Duke. And I specialize in a bunch of things that you can see up here on the screen. So I'm essentially a microeconometrician. I don't run general equilibrium models. I do empirical reduced form work. And I look at topics that are at the intersection of ag, environment, development, and I use it, and I collect all my data. So what that means is I design and implement studies in order to test specific hypotheses. That's what I do. And my dissertation was on arsenic in drinking water in Bangladesh, where I was looking at, it's not what you tell people, but it's how you tell people what you tell them, and whether the manner in which this information is shared helps people make safer choices about the water that they drink, because groundwater is contaminated with geologically occurring arsenic in Bangladesh, and it's a huge public health issue. And so I was looking at a bunch of things around how can information be used as an environmental health policy instrument, and does it work at all? Because when somebody comes and tells you that your tube well is contaminated and you can't drink from it, you have to stop drinking from your well and walk to the neighbor's well in order to get water, which means it's more cost of time, but they're also socially obliged. So there are economic costs to it, even though the costs may not be monetary. And so what are those? And so, if you take up this avertive behavior, do you continue to do it over time, or does this behavior simply unravel over time because, the costs of doing it are fairly high? And so I was looking at those kinds of dynamics over space and time. And then kind of I graduated, and then sort of there's always this big question of what do you do once you have a PhD? Do you join academia? Do you join research? Do you join government? And the thing is, I was interested in doing rigorous research, but I wanted to do it with the intention of influencing policy. And so that's the reason why I focused on trying to find a position in the CGIAR, which is this network of international organizations that were put together in the 60s and the 70s, specifically to do rigorous research in order to reduce poverty and improve food security in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And so that's kind of where I pretty much looked around for a job. And I was lucky enough, I found an opportunity, and then I joined the CGIAR. I specifically worked for the International Water Management Institute for many years, and I started as a postdoc. And, at the time that I left EME, which was about more than a year ago now, I was leading up the economics research group at EME. And that gave me an opportunity to really build up it gave me the opportunity to really work on my interests in terms of using rigorous research to inform policy and practice on the ground. And so one example of this is what we did in Bangladesh, where we were looking for sanitation solutions, right? Because Bangladesh has been phenomenally successful at reducing open defecation, and it's largely done it through the establishment of on-site sanitation structures, which essentially means that these are pit toilets where the contents and the waste empties into a pit in the ground. There is no sewerage. Sewerage systems are extremely expensive to install, and it wouldn't even make sense to do it in this context. But the problem is, once the pit fills up, what do you do with it? And typically people tend to, hire workers to clean these pits out. The waste is usually thrown in the field, in the water. It's highly polluting. It's a huge health problem. And so we were looking at what would it cost to design an emptying and transportation solution to empty pits and move them to a place where they can be treated enough so that they can be safely disposed in water. And so what we did was a whole bunch of people who got together, and we ended up designing sort of a system, a cost-effective transport and emptying and transport system. And then we also calculated what was the willingness to pay of households to contribute towards this, such services, right? Because nobody wants this waste in their own backyards. And what we realized there was households where you could raise the entire cost of emptying and transporting from households themselves. We did this for a fairly big municipality in Bangladesh as a case study. And we realized that the costs of emptying the pits and transporting it could be completely covered just through very minimal contributions from the house. And so the policy implication there is the government should not go ahead and subsidize pit emptying and transportation, which is essentially a private benefit, but should instead use what limited resources it has towards reducing the costs of treatment. Because treating sludge, especially sludge, which has very high water content, is quite expensive. And that's where the subsidy should be, not on this first component. And so this work got covered extensively by media. It was picked up by some of the biggest news agencies in the world. And then it also fed into policy recommendations that the National Committee for Fecal Sludge Management of the government of Bangladesh was putting together at the time, specifically on where subsidies should be prioritized rather than not. So it's about better targeting of subsidies, really. This is another example which we did in Tajikistan, which is one of the most food insecure countries in the world. It's part of the former Soviet Union. And essentially, one of the big reasons for food insecurity is because of water insecurity, because of a massive breakdown in irrigation systems when the Soviet Union collapsed, and a civil war, which then led to even greater destruction of services and infrastructure. And so was a huge revival in the early 2000s in order to rehabilitate this infrastructure, this irrigation infrastructure, which are these big command schemes, which are mostly gravity schemes that divert water from streams of rivers into southern Tajikistan, which is the breadbasket of the country. And so community-based management systems had been put into place in order to manage these schemes. And the government of Tajikistan, as well as the agency which had financed the rehabilitation of these schemes, which is USAID, were very keen to understand whether these rehabilitation efforts had indeed provided better water services to people, and whether that had translated into food security outcomes for households. And so we did an entire study on this. This was a large 4-year study, which is representative of pretty much all of Tajikistan. So it's a very large sample study. And we looked at a number of things out here using, again, survey data, methods of microeconometrics, etc. And we found a couple of things. We found that indeed the interventions that had been put into place had certainly improved the delivery of irrigation services to farms. And it had also improved food security, but these effects were mediated by gender. And the reason is because there is very high levels of male migration in southern Tajikistan, where men mostly move overseas to work either in Russia and increasingly in the Middle East. So the women are left behind. And unfortunately, globally, agricultural training, including training on irrigation and irrigation management, is mostly provided to the person whose name is written on the title of the land, and that's usually the man. Now, it's done on the assumption that the man will share, the head of the household, the male head of the household, will share information with other people, including women, in the event the male is not there to perform the tasks. That's a big assumption. That doesn't necessarily happen. Husbands don't necessarily share things with wives. And again, this is not just true of southern Tajikistan. I think this is a global phenomenon. And so the recommendation that we made was that given that there is such in and out movement of male labor, agricultural training and extension should be provided to both men and women, with the understanding that if training is going to be provided to women, you can't design training programs the same way you would do it for men. Because when women take on agricultural tasks, it's not as if they get a pass on home activities. They still have to cook and clean and take care of the father-in-law and, the aging mother-in-law and do other additional stuff. So there's a lot of burden and drudgery. So how do you reduce the drudgery? And that means you have to organize trainings in village. You have to break up training into smaller pieces. You have to provide for childcare facilities so that, she can come and she can attend. So there's a whole bunch of things that you do. You don't fix the women, you fix the program, right? And so that's the big recommendation that we gave. And these were actually taken up and implemented. Again, these results got a lot of coverage, again, by quite a bit of media, including, BBC, Radio Liberty. And these results were used by USAID and government of Tajikistan to change the way agricultural training programs and expand and make agricultural training programs more inclusive, for what they do. Then let me give you one example here from India, really, which is groundwater in Punjab, which I'm sure a lot of you sort of know about, that, that there is vastly, depleting levels of groundwater. Extraction massively exceeds recharge. And this is a resource that's dying out pretty quickly. And it's impossible, at least in the case of Punjab, in order to price water or price electricity, simply because there's always been a history of providing everything free of charge. And so there's a big sort of move to kind of to frame the problem in a separate manner, and to say that, well, if you can't punish people for bad behaviors, can we reward them for desirable behaviors? And so there was a pilot scheme that was implemented in Punjab called Pani Bachao Paisa Kamao. And what that scheme essentially did was it gave farmers quotas of electricity based on some understanding of historical use. It's hard to know what the farm level historical use is because meters are never being put on the farm, right? Because nobody has to pay for anything. But they made some calculation, the government made some calculation, and it was a fairly generous allocation that they gave to farmers. And essentially what they said was if the farmer did not use And the reason why this is interesting and attractive to the government is because if the farmer were to use a unit of electricity, it costs the government much more in subsidy than buying that same unit of energy back. So the farmer is no worse off. In fact, the farmer may be better off, and the government's losses are reduced. You still make a loss, but you just reduce the magnitude of the loss. And so, so this pilot scheme was implemented by the bank and the government of Punjab, and a bunch of us went in to evaluate it to see whether the scheme works or not. Does this, cash incentive scheme, the fact that you get this entitlement of electricity, and if you don't use it, it's bought back, so you have an incentive in cash, to not use all your entire quota. Does it actually change groundwater pumping behaviors? And we did this analysis at 2 separate levels. We did a farm level survey to look at self-reported behaviors on extracting water and using electricity. But we also did it at the feeder level using data on electricity consumption at the feeder level. And we did a bunch of things in order to be able to understand this. And the answer is, in this case, it does work. And the reason why it works is because everybody in Punjab, historically, nobody knows when electricity is going to be available in the agricultural feeder. So people have these small devices called auto starters, which they just put on their pumps. And so the minute there's electricity in the line, this auto starter detects that there is voltage that's available there, and then just starts the pump. So pumps keep running and fields keep getting irrigated, even when there is absolutely no reason to irrigate. Because nobody knows when this electricity will come. It could come in the middle of the night, so people don't want to go out in the middle of the night. And so what this cash incentive scheme does is it reduces the use of that auto starter. But it's contingent on knowing exactly when electricity will come. So if there is any sort of, disruption to, the timing in which you receive electricity, the scheme would not work. The other place the scheme will not work is if there are informal groundwater markets, where pump owners not only pump for themselves, but they also pump water for others who don't have pumps of their own and sell water to those farmers. And that's a similar scheme has been tried in areas where such informal groundwater markets exist in northern Gujarat. It doesn't produce any changes in behavior there. So again, word of caution on where this may not work. So based on this, again, the government of Punjab sort of, tweaked the scheme and has now scaled it up to a larger number of villages, and they're studying it at a larger scale as well. So what do I do at the bank? And so a whole bunch of stuff that I've been talking about so far is work that I started as a scientist and continue to do. But what do I specifically do at the bank? So at the bank, again, I look at analytics, for data for development finance and policy. So since I'm working in an organization that funds, many policies and programs and investments, how can we use data and analytics in order to have more meaningful and impactful policies and investments and financial operations on the ground? So I look at a bunch of things, like, for example, if you're going to try to increase or support irrigation expansion in Ethiopia, should public finance be going into subsidies to reduce the price of the pumps, or should it be used in order to provide loan products that small-scale farmers in the Ethiopian context can actually avail of, or should you actually be using it to reduce uncertainties? And so there's work that's just recently come out on that, which really talks about where should you, given that governments have limited money, where should you put money? That's an example. Another piece of work that I've been looking at is about where do you develop irrigation, right? Because in sub-Saharan Africa, there is a tendency to focus on developing irrigation in areas that are proximate to agricultural markets, in part because that increases the returns on investment of irrigation. But the problem is road network is pretty bad, and very small populations are actually connected to agricultural markets. And irrigation actually ends up being quite effective and a huge food security channel, including for people who are not formally connected to agricultural markets. So even those who are not proximate to agricultural markets, live pretty far away, end up generating surplus when they irrigate, which they're able to sell informally in local markets to neighbors, to friends, which, as we say in the paper, puts a little more food on their own plates and a little more cash in their pockets. So, again, where do we choose to focus when we think about developing irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa, where agriculture is still predominantly rain-fed? And that's the reason why it's problematic, because with climate change, rain-fed agriculture is even riskier than it used to be. there may be good reason to spread those investments around rather than focusing them in one particular area. I look at issues of forest policy and management in Nepal, where because of migration, the dependency on community or public resources versus development of private resources has changed. And so where people extract forest products, what kinds of products they extract, and their willingness to participate in forest conservation, which has historically been the case in Nepal, has changed because of remittances from abroad. And so it may very well be the case that at the moment, managing, there may be a different set of things that need to be done in order to manage public resources versus private resources. And so where does it make sense to do what? That's something that I'm looking at the moment. A big focus of my work is on solar irrigation in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, specifically understanding whether solar irrigation is indeed a climate mitigation strategy, or are we putting too much of stock in something, the carbon reductions from which are likely to be modest at best. So I'm looking at that. I look at issues of land restoration in Sub-Saharan Africa. So thinking about, why do these land restoration practices, why are they not taken up by agricultural households? There's a lot in the literature on the fact that people don't have tenure. And so why would you invest on land when you don't have tenure? And while that's fair enough, I think the labor story is equally important, because rural households are often strapped for labor. They're actually quite labor constrained. And so, and that's something that could actually be, in principle, quite easily fixed through program design in order to just, reducing drudgery, right? And how do we reduce drudgery, and where do we put that money, and what kind of support do we give in order to be able to do that? So that's another area of research that I'm looking at the moment. Yeah, and so all of this gets fed into sort of understanding, into supporting bank policies, investments, programs, and supporting, the governments in which, of the countries in which we do this work in order to just put into place better development programs that are better placed to deal with issues of poverty and inclusion. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen, and I'll open up for questions.
Thank you, ma'am. We are indeed honored to have heard such perspective words from you. Thank you for sharing your valuable insights. And now we will be having a question and answer session. So please raise your hands and unmute if you want to ask any question. And also you can write it down in the chat box.
Yeah, good morning, ma'am. First of all, thank you for your fabulous input for us.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Okay, yeah, thank you for your fabulous session, and happy International Women's Day to you. My query is, what are the institutional and societal recommendations to improve states of women? Societal and institutional recommendations.
Sorry, can you repeat that last line again?
Yeah. Institutional and societal changes.
Wow, that's a very big question. I'm not sure whether I'm necessarily qualified to really answer such a big question, right? The discipline of economics is something that looks at its strength and its limitation is the same, right? It sort of says conditional on institutions and conditional on society. Can we use this policy in a particular way, and what does it do, right?
Like concrete actions.
I mean, I think the one thing that's coming out of all research, I think that I do, is that it's extremely important to think about diversity and inclusion in whatever you do, right? There is no average farmer, there is no average household. So really understanding heterogeneity, and how does heterogeneity become key towards understanding anything, right? So it could be something as, in crop insurance, for example, right? Who crop insurance benefits and doesn't benefit is not equally distributed if you think about looking at it by age or gender, or depending upon the country, ethnicity, tribe, in India, caste. all of this matters, right? And so I think just thinking about heterogeneity in general, I think would be the big thing that I take away from what I do. It's to me, that's the big thing. I mean, I will be the first to point out and say that, like I said, there are larger, I mean, in an ideal world, you would say, oh, why don't we just get rid of, for example, in India, why don't we just get rid of caste? That cannot happen in a 5-year time span, right? That takes, I don't know, centuries, decades, millennia, I don't know. But I think thinking about what is the larger context in which you're trying to implement something, and how does that context influence who is likely to gain proportionately or likely to lose disproportionately. I think that's going to be critical and key. And I would encourage everybody who's thinking about this to think about diversity. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ma'am, also we have few questions in the chat box.
Rashi, I think it's questions are directed to you. You can read. They cannot unmute.
Okay, ma'am. So, ma'am, the first question is, like, most of your researches are based on less developed countries. So how long it takes for them to come out from basic problems like food, shelter, or look into environmental issues?
I think it depends. I think it really depends upon it depends on, I mean, there's a vast range. So the only country I can think of that has systematically and in an unprecedented manner brought I mean, this has happened everywhere. Lots of people have come out of poverty, and we know this globally. The one country whose effort has certainly been very impressive is China. We have data that tells us that. It's getting harder and harder to do that now as, you know, the economy changes, the global economy itself changes. So even China is going to necessarily, you know, not necessarily, it's not going to be, it's going to take a whole different thing, you know, bunch of things, because there are still a lot of people living in poverty in China. But China has certainly done a lot, but it's taken 45 years of systematic investments, you know, in a government that's a very specific form of government. It's not like India where governments change. And so I'm not defending or supporting that method of that particular way of governing a country. I'm just saying that is one way of doing it, and that's what the Chinese do. And so I think China has certainly done that. India had succeeded in bringing a lot of people out of poverty in about 15 years, but there is evidence that suggests that those gains are unraveling because of the pandemic and just the general state of the economy. And now at the moment, because of inflation in India, food inflation, which has hit. But I think it really varies depending upon where you are. And it's hard. I mean, getting people out of poverty requires a number of things to happen. It's one thing to prevent people from sliding further into poverty. And that's equally important as well. So a lot of the things that I talk about and a lot of the things that I look at are what I would say have features of social safety nets. So these are extremely important to make sure that when a shock happens, there's a floor that buffers people's fall, so to speak. Getting people out of poverty ultimately at the end of the day is going to involve, at least in low and middle income countries, is going to involve getting people out of agriculture, which is becoming harder to do just because of how the economy globally is shifting. So it's a good question, but if we had an answer to that question, we'd have done it.
Ma'am, do you really think international organizations like World Bank, IMF, UNO can bring big changes at ground level? Like, if so, can you please give some real impact stories?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by big change. I mean, at the end of the day, international organizations, as you know, end up working with host countries. And so, you know, things that get done are a consequence of what requirement there is on the ground. And certainly many of these organizations end up facilitating and financing a number of things. You know, one of the biggest things that I think that, for example, with the bank is trainings, just a lot of trainings and how to collect data, how to think about things, how to access to resources. but at the end of the day, development financing is frankly a very small part of, like even in India, the bank's budget is a drop in the ocean of what India's GDP and what India's economy is, right? So at the end of the day, I think you want to view these as organizations that have ideas, are certainly help with cross learning, because I think we see things from different perspectives. We see how the same problem plays out in different ways in different countries. So there's a lot of opportunities to think about how do you like draw lessons from one place, or even draw cautionary tales from places, right? Because it's not just about success. It's also about, when we know things don't work, learning from why things don't work and trying to make sure we avoid those mistakes again is also equally important. And I think, international organizations certainly come with that perspective.
Ma'am, as students, like we are all keen to ask this, like what kind of a skill is required and to be developed to become a good researcher?
Well, it depends. I mean, there is no one kind of economist, right? I mean, different people do very different things. I'm interested in issues of poverty and in the environment. And for what I'm interested in, by definition, if you're interested in poverty, I mean, you have to kind of go microeconometric, because, things like CGE models are not very well equipped to deal with issues of poverty and distribution. So it really depends upon what you want to do at the end of the day and what interests you. Ultimately, at the end of the day, economics is one piece of the larger puzzle, right? It's bringing in, depending on the context you have as an economist, you do have the the skills to bring in rigorous, contextually appropriate insights that then become an important part of how a decision is made. It's not the only basis on which a decision should be made, because we can't answer every question we want to using the methods of economics. There are many questions that I'm certainly very interested in having answers to, but I don't think we necessarily have the tools within the discipline for it. And so I think there's no one way to do this. I think different people are interested in different things, and it depends on the kind of economist you want to be. I'm just one kind. There are so many other kinds, right?
And ma'am, as we know, still somewhere male-dominant society exists. So my question is that how do you succeed in a male-dominated environment?
That's a good question. I mean, I think this is a great time to be a woman at the moment. I would certainly not have wanted to be born, in the 1940s or the 50s or anything like that. I think this is a great time to be female, and I think, there's always going to be. We do live in a world, a heteronormative world, which was designed by heterosexual men for heterosexual men. I agree, that's true. But I think it's great that we're even able to ask this question and have this conversation, right? 35 years ago, even this would not have been possible. And so I think things change. I do think things are changing. They're probably not changing as fast as we'd like them to. And so, but that partly depends on us, right? The space that we create locally, if we are interested in creating an inclusive workspace, then we should all put our money where our mouth is and actually do it and support people, right? And I think at the end of the day, there are lots of allies everywhere, not just in women, but also in men. So yes, chauvinism, sexism, to some extent racism, all of these are real. I am not going to lie and say they don't exist. But I think we're lucky that we're living in a time where talking about it is less taboo than what it was. And I think that's where things begin. And I think on a professional front, a good way to equip yourself is to talk to people who do different things. So if you are a woman or even a young man, looking into sort of, you want to be able to do something, and how do you work your way through the system? Because there is a system in everything, unfortunately. That's also true. Talk to people who've done it. Ask them how do they navigate these things. So if you're on the job market, definitely negotiate for a salary. I mean, be realistic about, what you can negotiate for. Talk to people who've done it, understand what is the sort of the boundaries in which you can play, and do so, right? If you are going to be up for promotion, think about how can you make your best case out there. Talk to people who've done it before, write up this is why I need to be promoted, get somebody else to look at it and who's been through that, and ask them to give you feedback, which could, by the way, also be men. And I've been very fortunate. I've had fantastic male and female mentors. And so there's something to learn from everybody. So, be an ally, so that's the best thing I can say.
Ma'am, like today, as we all know, today is Women's Day. So India has like less female labor participation rate. So as a successful woman, how do you see this as a problem? Like, what is the way out?
I'm not sure I can speak for all women. I can only speak for myself. Again, I think there's a number of reasons why that is the case, right? Part of it has got to do with how we view women's labor. And, in many contexts, what does it mean to be emancipated? I'm not even sure I understand what that means, right? So, to some people, having agency over, your economic resources is emancipation. To others, having a parent or a spouse who's able to provide for them is, their idea of, a good life or welfare. I think it's really very hard to, to say, and I'm not sure whether it is really for me to make these decisions for other people. But I will say this: if we are interested in solving our problems, and please believe me when I say that there are very complex problems in India, it is going to require a lot more participation from non-heterosexual males in the workplace and in politics and in pretty much every aspect of our life. So in a sense, if we are committed as a nation in our individual capacity to address these problems, it is going to require different people to come on board. Because remember, the way you see a problem is a function of you. So different people with different backgrounds, with different constraints, will see the same thing in a different way. And that's really what inclusion is about. So in a sense, by, cause and effect become the same. And so it's a hard one. And like I said, it's very hard to say, how do you solve this problem without being prescriptive, which is the very opposite of feminism, right? I mean, being prescriptive is not what feminism is about. So, but all I will say is this: I mean, if we are, as a society, if women in a society are interested in living in a society, living in an India where there are truly equal rights and opportunities for women and women, it will mean having a lot more women come into the workforce. That's the only way you can solve it. You cannot have a solution that works for you unless you sit at the table. That's the one big thing that I will say. That's the one big thing I've learned from 20 plus years of my professional life. If you want a solution that works reasonably well for you as well, you've got to bite the bullet and you've got to get to the table. It's messy and it's complicated, but unless you're there, you're not represented. So representation matters in everything.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking all our questions. Gratitude is a powerful catalyst for happiness. It's the spark that lights a fire of joy in our souls. Now I invite Ms. Sonali from second year M Economics to propose the vote of thanks.
A very warm good morning to one and all present. It's a delight to deliver the vote of thanks for this evening. Firstly, I'd like to thank Dr. Soumya Balasubramanian, Senior Economist, World Bank, who took out time from her busy schedule to enrich us with her encouraging words. I'd like to thank our coordinator, Dr. K. Vinoda Devi, for a round-the-clock support in the success of this event. I'd also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the coordinator for today's event, Dr. Siva Subramanian, for their extended support in organization of this event. I'd like to thank all the faculty members of our Department of Economics for their endless guidance and support. Lastly, I'd like to thank all the participants for the patient listening and active involvement in this meeting. Lastly, I thank you all. I leave.
Thank you, Sonali. So as now we have come an end to our session. So thank you all for your participation, and a feedback form has been there, like it's there in the chat box. So please fill it before you leave the meeting. And once again, thank you, ma'am, and have a great day ahead, everyone. And once again, I wish you all a very happy International Women's Day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you all. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye, ma'am. Thank you so much, Soumya, ma'am. Happy Women's
No problem.
Day.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.